Hi, Matt.
Hey Graham, good to see you.
Good to see you. Welcome, everyone, to Crazy in Love, the podcast where two psychotherapists talk about modern relationships. A big part of modern relationships, Matt, is neurodiversity
Yeah,
and the conversation globally on neurodiversity and its implications for the world of work, for the world of politics. But we're going to narrow down over this short series on neurodiversity into how it plays out in relationships. Today, we're going to focus much more specifically on ADHD, the diagnosis of ADHD and how it shows up in relationships, and particularly if you're in a relationship and one of you or your partner have a diagnosis or think you are neurodiverse in that way, how that plays itself out in the relationship. Because I see a lot in my couples work, I imagine you do in
yeah,
certain
yeah.
ways. Let's start there. What do you see into, before we get into kind of some stats and how the
Sure.
diagnosis plays itself out, what do you see in your clinical work with ADHD and couples?
I mean, you definitely see it, don't you? I think is the first thing. So, I mean, I'm not an ADHD skeptic. We'll talk about overdiagnosis in a minute or two, won't we? But I
Yeah.
think you know it when you see it, or you certainly do as a clinician. You know it, I think, in your children as well, if you're in this area of work professionally, and you also see it in other people's kids. So when somebody is is presenting for couples therapy or even individual therapy, it's definitely on my mind because I think it's a hugely influencing factor, and it's characterized, I think, in lots of the ways that that people will be familiar with in relationships. I think it shows up in ways that are less discussed and less obvious. So impulsive purchases would be like one thing. We've
Mm.
agreed on a budget, we've agreed on a set of financial arrangements, and somebody busts through that with a kind of impulse purchase. That in itself isn't ADHD, but those are the kinds of indicators. Somebody who is interrupting all the time alone is not a symptom of ADHD, but you're putting those two things together and you're starting to get a pattern. Somebody who only wants to do things when it's spontaneous, so doesn't really want to get into difficult conversations, doesn't want to think seriously about how to schedule something like sex in a busy family life because it should just be spontaneous. Those are a few of the ways that it would start to show up. And I would be looking for other clues as well. And if we were doing something a bit more diagnostic on that, we'd be going back into childhood, wouldn't we, and making sure that those are, symptoms that run through life. But that would be, those would be just a few examples of where I would see it. But what about you? Do those ring true? They ring a bell? Would you have said something different? What would you add? What would you amend?
So in some ways, I think it's easier for the couples that I've worked with. It's easier when the diagnosis has been present for quite some time
Yeah,
and often from childhood. So at the more extreme end of the neurodiversity spectrum, and it's been picked up usually in childhood. If it's for the man, it's often with hyperactivity, can't sit still, can't pay attention. That's usually more visible with boys and diagnosed early. With girls, the kind of inattention bit of it tends to be diagnosed a little bit later, as I understand it, and
yep,
noticed and diagnosed a little bit later. Because if a diagnosis is made early, both people often enter the relationship with that in mind. It's medication might have been sought, that someone's
yeah,
obviously got it as part of their identity in
yeah,
dating and relationships, and has possibly already started developing coping mechanisms both for themselves and to understand the limitations and strengths of ADHD within a relationship, and then talking from the early days of that relationship about it. I think what's been problematic more recently is and helpful, so let me caveat it in those ways, it is the increasing diagnosis of neurodiversity and ADHD in particular. So as someone like Suzanne O'Sullivan would point out, the increase in diagnosis rates, I think the diagnosis rates in the UK have gone up about sevenfold in the last decade. It's a big expansion of diagnosis in the UK, to a point where a lot of that new diagnosis is happening more at the moderate to mild end of the spectrum. Again, for want of a better phrase, but let's stick with the idea of
yeah,
on a spectrum for now.
yeah.
That is helpful in a certain sense, because it helps people understand their personalities and their impulses, and gives them a framework to talk to their partners about who they are and why they might be behaving in certain ways in the relationship. we'll talk more, I think, during this conversation about the ways that that's limiting, about the ways that that gets in the way, when it gets too rigid, when it becomes like I can't help it. You hear things like that. It's part of, I am ADHD. This is how I behave. You just need to get used to it. It's when it becomes
Yeah.
fixed identity, particularly at the more mild and moderate end, where it manifests in behavior like forgetting what someone asked you to buy down the shops. It's okay when you do it once, but when you've done it the 10th time, or when you're
Yeah.
forgetting important dates in the calendar.
A good example is, it's another example, perhaps I should have mentioned that up front. And I guess the frustration that you're talking to there, often experienced by the other partner, whether they do or don't experience ADHD themselves, is a kind of refusal to fall back on a mechanism or do something prosaic like make a checklist or write it down, so that when you go to the shop, you're checking it off, or you're not forgetting to pick the dry cleaning up because it's on your little list. And even if you did forget, you're going to look, you're going to remember, you're going to turn around, you're going to fix it up. But the refusal to do that for the umpteenth time is the kind of maddening thing that's frustrating, huh? It's not me, it's my ADHD.
Yes, exactly. And all of the behaviors you could list as part of as symptoms of, or as part of a diagnosis of ADHD, you could say are in another person without a diagnosis of personality traits, right? They're
Yeah.
habits or personality traits. They're a way that our brains work, and that manifest itself in behavior in the world. Now, if we're not taking responsibility as individuals within a system, this system being the relationship, for that behavior, it sends a signal that you're not willing to even attempt to change.
Yeah, I agree.
Already, I'm conscious we're already moving into that model of ADHD being problematic, and I
Yeah,
think that
yeah.
that's where the kind of where you might push back on it is to say something like, we used to, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but we used to diagnose more at the extreme end of the spectrum, where it genuinely is and most individuals with the diagnosis would agree that it's having really negative impacts on their life. You'd say this
Yeah.
with autism, you'd say it with ADHD, you'd say you'd recognize it when you see it, like you said earlier, but
Yeah.
actually in the modern day, I'm not sure you would recognize it when you see it. It kind of, you wouldn't get into a relationship with some of the people we're talking about and think this is a person with ADHD. You might think this.
No, I think you're right to push back against that. I suppose I don't think of myself as expert in this area, just kind of having a working knowledge rather than anything else. But I think you and I might see it, and I think other people don't. You wouldn't see that in ordinary life. When I talk to parents, they're often puzzled by the behavior of their children, and you can see sometimes what's going on there, whether it be ADHD or something else. I think we bring a sort of certain professional perspective to it, but I think if it's meaningful to talk about it, it can be seen and it will manifest in behaviors, and it is problematic. I think for the people who recognize that they've got some of those symptoms or behaviors, or that diagnosis, if they want to talk in those terms, it usually is a problem. Like, they would go along with, I don't know, the current thinking would probably be something like, we would understand it as a disorder, related to poor self-regulation, poor self-control. I think it can sound a bit pejorative, but I think that is the easiest way to say it and explain it. And that is certainly what people come to me and talk about, even if they're not identifying the diagnosis. So kind of executive functions that have gone wrong, or that are really, really difficult to manage. And executive functions, like, if people are not familiar with that term, probably something like time management, organization, problem solving.
Yeah.
Bit of self-motivation is in there, isn't it? A bit of impulse control, and sometimes inhibiting yourself from what is a bad or rash idea, and then managing the emotions that go alongside that. So those sort of, broadly, those 5 component parts making up that kind of idea of executive control, and causing, I think, genuine chaos in people's lives, oftentimes. And I guess that's the bit that I think some clinicians and the current discourse shies away from a bit. ADHD is my superpower. Well, kinda, but also not.
Yeah, and in relationships, you can see how, particularly early on, you'd be massively drawn to someone who was quite charismatic, quite impulsive,
Yeah.
quite funny, I imagine,
Yeah,
creative.
uninhibited, right? They're just,
You can
they're the
see
life and soul,
massive,
aren't they?
massive strengths in your 20s when you're dating,
Yeah.
massively attractive. Uh, in relationships, when you start then getting responsibilities, you start having kids, you start having bills to pay, bills have a regularity, have an
Yeah,
admin function, someone's
yeah,
got to
yeah.
do them, someone's got to remember to do them, etc. Life becomes a bit more, for better or worse,
Yeah.
becomes more structured, and with greater
Kids need a lunch, don't they? Or they need a
yeah,
lunch
packed
because it's a
lunch.
special day, or we're
Yeah,
wearing
you also
green on
need someone
Tuesday and
to
we can bring the books in on Friday and it's a
right.
different kit on. Yeah.
So it's not just in the moment, it's about anticipation of that and planning
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
that, and the impulse control that that requires in terms of what do I not do when I actually have to go to Tesco's?
Yeah.
What do I put off to do that? I
Yeah.
think just to build on that point, that it's not always a superpower, although it obviously has in certain circumstances massive strengths. The stats bear it out, right? People with ADHD are twice as likely to be divorced, for
Yeah.
example. That speaks
Yeah.
for itself. Like much of that is the fault of our culture that can't understand and lay the groundwork for healthy relationships in those contexts, I think. But for better or worse, we live in a culture where people with the diagnosis of ADHD are twice as likely to be divorced. That says something about what it's like to be in a relationship with someone with that diagnosis.
Yeah, and what it's like to be in a relationship with that diagnosis when the other person is critical of you, or aiming things at your character, which are just much more, I suppose, baked in and neurological rather than anything else. Insofar as we, understand the origins and genesis of ADHD and other aspects of neurodiversity, like you would end up being bugged all the time, wouldn't you? You would end up being criticized for things that you feel are, something you can't do a very great deal about. I think that's the promise of therapy. It's the promise of, I guess, medication as well. But I think kind of therapy with people who've got ADHD, particularly cognitive behavioral therapy, is giving you tools and techniques, many of which you won't like and you won't enjoy, but it is giving you tools and techniques to get stuff done. In children, tidy your bedroom is a hopeless instruction more generally, but is doubly hopeless for a kid with ADHD. They got to be told something like pick up the clothes from the floor. That's task number one. Then we're going to tidy the books up, and then we might get on to task three and we might not. But tidy the bedroom is an overwhelming, kind of complicating, confusing thing, and chastising or berating the child because they've not been able to break that task down into steps would be similar in a relationship. There would be other examples there where it's very, very difficult for that person to sit down, to want to schedule and then sit down and have a difficult conversation about money and finances and savings and spending plans. Not what they're interested in, not what they're good at, not what motivates them or hits their reward circuits.
No, it's interesting you chose tidy the bedroom as an example, just because it made me think of the classic dynamic within a relationship where there's a parentification, there's a parent and child dynamic,
Yeah,
there's a
yeah,
nagging dynamic, there's a you can't do this, so I need to show you how to do it dynamic, which gets old pretty bloody quick in my
yeah, sure, yeah,
leads
yeah,
to resentment and leads to frustration and leads to
yeah,
you're not listening. You're almost like a teacher trying to teach a reluctant child how to do something.
yeah.
And that over time, that reluctant child feeling shamed, feeling crappy about themselves, confused as to potentially as to why they can't do it like their
Mhm.
partner if they haven't had a diagnosis, all sorts of things that I've seen in my work with couples. That yeah, if there's any kind of piece of advice for couples who are in this situation, I'd like them to take out of this conversation is you've got to get out of that dynamic pretty sharp. You've got to get out of the parent-child dynamic and the nagging pretty quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's more generally, I guess, what both of us are saying to couples all the time. If you're having a conversation which leans that way, that one person receives it as a child, a kind of, sulky brat child or stroppy teenage child or dependent child, then it's going wrong. If somebody is speaking down to the other consistently, that's going wrong as well, right? If you're nagging or you're upbraiding somebody, that's going wrong. We're looking for that adult connection, aren't we? All the time. Doesn't matter whether somebody is neurodiverse or not. And I suppose not wanting to sort of give the ending away too soon, but clear communication, patience, and understanding and curiosity for the other person's point of view is pretty much the prescription for all couples. It's just probably more pressing when there's something like ADHD, evidently present in that relation, becomes less optional. You can be less leisurely about that. You really are at risk, probably the relationship going south if you don't do those things with a degree of seriousness. And those things, I think, are headlines. Within those, there are some specifics that people should be, should be doing. But if we're not acknowledging the other person's point of view, and we're not interested in that, and we're not respectful of that, and we're not then building on that and then countering it or challenging it in some ways in love, like, we're not really doing anything together. We're just getting fed up with one another, or we're withdrawing, slowly going our own ways, and sorting out our own problems and pursuing our own interests, absent from the other person.
Yeah, so some of what you're saying, let's have the diagnosis conversation,
Yeah,
because I'm whilst listening to you then, I was thinking about the benefits of a diagnosis, even at the milder end of the spectrum, in the sense of it gives you a shared understanding, a shared lingua franca, a
yeah,
shared sense of, okay, there's an external issue we're dealing with collectively in the relationship, rather than in that parent-child dynamic that one person is the problem that needs to be fixed and needs to be improved. I think that's where it can be really helpful. You've got a few more kind of concerns about overdiagnosis. Would that be too strong a way to
I don't know. I feel ambivalent about it, really. I think if the diagnosis leads to something constructive, a better understanding, more determination to deal with it, or more capacity to deal with it because it's an actual thing rather than a, fault or a flaw in me or a kind of moral failing, then I would be all for it. When people are wanting to be diagnosed, I'm always curious about why and what it will give them. Like, access to medication is perhaps the most obvious thing, but that alone probably will be insufficient, right? You would usually couple that with something like cognitive behavioral techniques to manage day-to-day tasks and living. And I'm absolutely not against medication in this or any other area, but I think you've got to be clear about what it is you want from that. And there's a risk, isn't there, that it becomes a self-identity, or it becomes an excuse or a crutch. And I think you see that a little bit in schools, where sometimes
Yes.
someone's got a diagnosis and then the school move heaven and earth, or they just introduce kind of slightly daft, wonky ideas that seem to help, or that purport to help, or respond to the
And
will of the
and
parent.
it tends to be the parent driving that rather than the child. So it's something that the child is just living their life and trying their best to
Yeah.
learn and to develop friendships, and is someone from outside is kind of coming in and saying, in effect, you're doing this sort of stuff wrong, and here's an identity label that will potentially follow you throughout life. That
Yeah.
I think part of me is a bit cautious about that.
Yeah, I mean, I would go further. I'm deeply cautious about that. I'm deeply cautious about the level of expertise that's available in schools, or even within busy parents, to be able to determine what is right in those instances. And often they're prescriptions like, you can arrive late to a thing, or you can leave the class early so you're not getting caught up in huge crowds. You can cut the line of the dinner queue. You can even wear, like, a hat or something in a classroom. And I would struggle to see who that is helping, and I would struggle to see that is making a material difference to somebody's life. I would probably suggest the opposite is likely to be true. The other kids don't understand, they resent it. It doesn't really make any sense, and it signals and marks someone out in a way that is, I would guess, unhelpful for them in more instances than not.
Well, there's an empirical question there about outcomes, and from what I understand, again from Suzanne O'Sullivan's work and others, those interventions have little, if no, benefit in terms of educational outcome.
Okay.
It also, from a more kind of psychological perspective, which I'm better placed to talk about, it sends a signal about resilience, doesn't it? It sends a
Sure.
signal about other children are being expected to be resilient in this situation, and you're being told that you can't cope and you need external supports through wobble chairs or whatever it might be to be able to manage those executive functions. And again, if you can do that in school, and it benefits the teacher in terms of their capacity to teach the class, and it genuinely helps someone sit still for a while, it's not a massive intervention that's hurting anyone. Whether you need to label that as ADHD and create this identity
Yeah.
around it is a separate question, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I
And
agree.
then
I'm sat here and I've got like a fidget toy thing
yeah,
that
yeah,
I
yeah.
that I'm fidgeting with because I've got busy hands, and so that's a thing, right? You see a lot of that in schools. I think there are some things that are genuinely useful if it's useful for the kid. If it's not useful, it's not useful. But I think the things that give them a perceived advantage or a significant difference over others, just not quite readying people for the real world as well in that situation. As it, my son gets some extra time, and I'm really in two minds about whether that is a good idea, because not many workplaces I've been in where you would be given extra time to complete a task, you would probably then be removed from the next prestigious, high profile or important thing because actually you can't discharge the work as quickly as other people. And I guess a life preparing for that, a decade of preparing from that for the age of like 12 to 22 when you enter the workplace, I'm not sure is hugely to
No,
its
bring it,
benefit.
if we bring that back to relationships, right? In some ways you do get more time, and in some ways you don't get more time, right? If you draw the parallel to relationships, so you don't get more time in the sense if there's 24 hours in a day, you still got to get everything done. You still got to get the kids to bed. You still got to try and maintain your relationship and do your work. So you don't get more time. But if you know that about yourself, you can buy yourself more time in certain situations. You can prepare your partner and say,
Yeah,
I need an hour before we have this conversation, or don't try and have this conversation with me now, or
yeah,
I'm going to do that task, but I'm not going to do it now because I'm just not ready for it. I'm going to do it at a time when you would prefer me to do it now, but I'm going to do it later.
yeah.
That's potentially a practical way of trying to manifest it in a more healthy way in a relationship.
Yeah, I agree, and I don't know whether this is the moment to segue or come back to what you were asking a minute or two back about diagnosis at the milder end. So it's sort of much closer to what you think of normal behavior, sort of normal being a kind of statistical average rather than a moral
Sure.
judgment.
Yeah.
And I guess it's the whole premise of like certain types of therapy, like rational emotive behavioral therapy, which is kind of branch of cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy is helping people deal with impulses and low frustration tolerance a lot of the time. And don't we all have that? I don't think I'm bringing much in terms of ADHD into a relationship. I'm definitely bringing those things. And all the couples I see, they're all a pain in the ass to live with. And once we've sort of got over blaming the other person, almost everyone can see that, right? You're a pain in the ass to live with. My wife is a pain in the ass to live with, and I love living with her. But those things are true at the same time. My boys would like to have sweet things before their meal. And if they've got something, like if they've got sweets or treats or something, they would eat it before the main meal. It's not an ADHD thing. That's a kind of childish impatience thing, right? We've all got to find ways of managing that, and it's obvious to me what to do in that instance, that we're going to postpone that until the meal's been eaten because somebody's taken time preparing it, it's reasonably nutritionally balanced, etc., all the obvious reasons. I think sometimes when I see people dealing with ADHD with children and in a relationship, that we're always going the extra mile or always easing off those kind of challenges, or hey, this doesn't work for me, or this isn't going to fly, or there are some norms
Yeah,
that
I
we
think you're in danger though of downplaying quite how difficult it is for those who would get a diagnosis for ADHD to benefit from some of those CBT type techniques in very quickly, and how
Yep.
much shame there is with that, and how much, if a relationship has been going for 10 years already, how much nagging there's been, how
Yeah,
much
yeah,
that person's been made to feel confused as to why that they struggle with these
yeah,
techniques, and why can't they show their partner that they love them in the way that they want to, and
yeah.
am I ever going to have a successful relationship, all of those sorts of things that I think at the more extreme end of the spectrum, I think can be so difficult
Mm.
to change, to really kind of respond and go, okay, I can work on my executive function, I can work on my planning. Yes, of course, certain tools and techniques like writing things down or electronic reminders or shared
Yeah,
calendars, they can all help.
yeah,
But I think a big task that we haven't yet talked about today is about acceptance, is about understanding the limits and the
yeah,
expectations in a relationship. And being in a relationship with someone might require you to say, I'm in a relationship where I'm going to feel pissed off that my birthday gets forgotten, for example.
Yeah, yeah,
Or, uh, the school shopping isn't done this week because it's dropped through the cracks again. That is part of your
yeah.
life, and you have a choice about whether you accept that as your life or you have to get out. One of the two. What you can't do is stick around and nag and try
Yeah,
and
no, I think that's good. I think that's a good challenge. I think it cuts both ways, doesn't it? I mean, not that you're saying otherwise, but there is also something like I am causing you distress by consistently forgetting anniversaries and the
yeah,
things that matter to you. And you told
causing you
me,
distress by being me as well.
yeah, yeah, you told me it was your one of your parents' birthdays, and you reminded me, and you put it in the shared calendar that you set up and that I said I'd look at, and I didn't look at it, and I
Yeah,
don't know,
exactly.
and therefore I've double
Yeah.
booked, and
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Yes. Yes. Exactly that. That I think the there's a lot of people who'll be listening to this and who will be going to couples therapy who can benefit from the kind of interventions that we're talking about. I
Yeah.
think it's a smaller cohort of people where at the more extreme end, they're dealing with challenges that are much more about acceptance and expectations than they are about change.
Yeah, I think that's a really I think it's a really useful point, and I think it sort of takes me back to, I don't know, maybe the example with children or the example of my own son. There is a kind of, okay, so if we do allow extra time, which seems to be a sensible intervention in many respects, what does that mean in due course? And does that limit the world of work? Does it mean it's certain types of jobs or in certain industries? Does it have an impact on, future earnings, those sorts of things? And I guess, if we were pushing your point through, that might be some of it as well. I don't know whether you had any stats or numbers on earning power, but I bet there's a penalty, right, for being neurodiverse in terms of your future earning.
Yeah, I don't to my fingertips. I think of it that the thought that you were just having more about the acceptance of where are those strengths going to be most utilized and cultivated and cherished. Like there will be industries
Yes.
throughout the economy where you would be able to maybe work on your own more than usual.
Yes.
Be able to
Yeah.
set your own timescales. You'd be able to be more creative,
Yeah.
spontaneous than other jobs.
Yeah.
There'd be industries that facilitate that much more than the type of work we used to do, for example, working for the
Yeah.
government.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where
Absolutely.
I don't imagine it would be particularly rewarded.
It would be just not, it would not compute with the kind of people that excel at that sort of work, logical thinking, breaking things down into sequences, analyzing in a rigorous way. I think it's part of the challenge is there. I think, irrespective of ADHD or neurodiversity, the sort of overlay with, I guess, your basic personality traits is intriguing as well, isn't it? Because I think you do find people who are just less conscientious, right?
Yeah.
So what do
Yes.
they do in the world of work? And you find people who are far more creative or diffuse and divergent thinkers. And some people are very, very sequential. And you can imagine the sorts of jobs those would go into. Perhaps it's a little harder to imagine what people with creative ways of thinking would go into. But if you were looking to develop a product or use it for other purposes or come up with something out of nothing, you would want the creatives. You would want the people who are all over the place in terms of their thinking patterns. You would not want the people who had, taken the kind of academic route and career route that you and I took. And I find that about myself. I don't know whether you'd say this of yourself. No particular imperative to respond, but I am not creative in any way, shape, or form. It's just not me.
Uh, I, I think the idea of doing creative tasks fills me with dread as well.
Yeah,
Just that idea of being encouraged to be creative and to
yeah,
be free forming,
yeah,
I find uh, awful. So even if you do want to set a creative task, I want very tight confines. I want you to say, "Here's a tiny
yeah,
canvas. I want you to draw a picture of a
yeah,
giraffe or something."
yeah.
Then I've got something to work with. If you just
Sure.
kind of give me
Yeah.
some tools and say, "Be creative," I'm stumped. Yeah, totally.
In our old world, it's a sort of submissions template, isn't it? With very set headings and very particular ways you would set that out. Or it's a
Big,
science report at school where you document the
yeah,
instruments that you use, the
yeah,
method you followed. And we know exactly exactly what we're doing. But if you have a wacky thought or you join it up with something you've learned in another classroom,
Expand on this point about personality overlays, and maybe we can bring in things like attachment that listeners might be interested in. That there's an overlay, isn't there, in some ways, that there is a kind of correlation between insecure attachment styles and neurodiversity. Like, you are more likely to have an insecure attachment style with neurodiversity. Like you were talking about conscientiousness, one of the big
yeah.
fives. There probably is a massive overlay, I imagine, between ADHD and conscientiousness at one end of the spectrum.
Yeah, I think so. I think what I would guess I was just gently pushing back against your idea that it's very, very hard for people with a genuine confirmed diagnosis of ADHD to do stuff that's counter to their impulse or defaults, and I think that's true of all of us. My
Yes, I agree. I agree.
instinct something, or my impulse to spend rather than to save, or to eat something that's not going to be to my benefit, and my desire to not do something that's in my medium long-term interest is very great. It's on me every day. So I think about it in terms of addiction, and some of the people I work with who are in or attempting to escape from active addiction, it's kind of very similar to that sort of thing. You are straining against an impulse, a kind of set of
Mm.
behaviors, and probably a natural inclination to be conscientious, to come back to the personality traits, or really not to like socializing at all. If your partner likes that, you're going to have to push yourself sometimes to do that. You're going to have to accept that you'll be exhausted at the end of it and glad it's over, but you don't have
Yeah.
to badmouth the host or
I,
rush
I, ag-
the evening.
I agree with all of that. I agree strongly with all that. I think it's really helpful. I've recently digested a book that I'd recommend to listeners, Me But Better by Olga Kazan. And the the idea of that book is she's taking a year to test out what different parts of her big five personality traits she can shift. And the general consensus in the book, understandably, gets to the resolution of, well, you can change it a little bit, but
Yeah,
not much, and it takes quite a lot of work to change it. I think
yeah,
the difference between the more extreme end of neurodiversity and ADHD and what you were just talking about, though, is that it's an everyday struggle, right?
yeah,
So if you
yeah,
take extroversion, introversion on the personality
yeah.
traits side of things, you can occasionally take yourself out of your comfort zone and prove to your partner that you're making an effort, and that's an important bend towards them, and you're making a bit of a, you're trying to meet them halfway to show that you love them and care about them. If you've got a diagnosis of ADHD and some of the behaviors and some of the way that those neural pathways manifest themselves in day-to-day lives and logistical planning, the way that that can look is that every day I've got to be swimming against the grain to try and
Yeah,
so
yeah,
I can
yeah.
remember to do
Well,
things.
I think that's true. I mean, I don't think there's any way of fancying that up or talking around it. I think that is true. I think it's why it's a problem, why it's a serious diagnosis, and why it kicks people in the arse. So I would say you're absolutely right, and it is regrettable. And there's your choice point, right? But I think it is also true of other things like addiction. It's true of
Yes.
anger management. I think it's true of many conditions that people face, even sort of basic anxiety, be anxious about
Mm.
speaking in front of a team meeting, or anxious about being called on in school for your input on a thing, anxious about what part you play in a team, in a theatrical performance. If you're a young person being compelled to do those things at school, I think the whole thing can feel difficult. And I'm not really sort of trying to grade that as an Olympics, one thing harder than the other, but I think it's on a lot of people I see that every day is a challenge to, if they are insecurely attached, not to manifest that at every moment of every day, to catch the thoughts that lead to it, to behave against it, to take the opposite action. Same for the people who avoid proximity and closeness and intimacy in relationships. There's a choice point, isn't there? A way or
Multiple
two.
times a day.
Say
Yeah.
again?
Multiple times a day.
Oh, it's on you every moment of every day, isn't it? I think, in Buddhism, they would sort of say towards enlightenment or away. It's like every moment is that, isn't it? It's like literally every moment would be that same sort of model in addiction recovery. Often, is this helping and aiding my recovery, or is this taking me into more dangerous space? Too much time alone, too much proximity to this, too many gloomy, sad thoughts, too little reaching out to family members, friends, or other people who are in addiction recovery, who can provide kind of ballast and resilience for you. That kind of thing. So I think at the end where it's kicking people in the arse, day in and day out. So a
Mm.
really serious something to grapple with, right? And I think if you don't, you get fairly hit hard by the consequences. I think there's a lot of talk, rhetoric around how we're more open to those things, but not really. I don't think so. Not necessarily beyond some of the lighter solutions that we were discussing in school. And I don't think we've yet really seen cohort or generation go into the workplace proclaiming neurodiversity and being received in that environment and then progressing through it. Like, I think that will be interesting to watch. Will that work? Will workplaces genuinely make reasonable adjustments for those people, or will they say they do but not really?
And just again, bringing it back to the world of relationships, what that cohort of individuals, how their relationships look, is there enough flexibility? Does the lack of shame and the upfront understanding of neurodiversity help relationships be more flexible, or does the identity factor and the rigidity of that identity actually cause more harm than good? I think we're just going to have to wait and see, I guess.
Yeah. There's some real challenges there, aren't there? And I guess to come back to, maybe we didn't give quite enough time to the joy of some of those things. Some of my son's friends who are diagnosed and not yet diagnosed but show all of the traits, they're really fun guys to be around. They talk in wild and wacky ways. I adore my two boys and the conversations I have with them, but sometimes when you meet somebody who's clearly exhibiting ADHD, the pace and the scale and scope of what they're talking about, their imagination, their energy levels are, I don't know. I mean, they're overwhelming, but in a great way as well. They're a ton of fun to be around, and also they are a lot to be around. They're a lot to manage.
I do a lot of work in schools for as part of a different part of my life, and that it feels like such a shame sometimes when you go into a school and you see 30 kids of 8, 9, 10 years old, all of whom are being expected to sit still for hours at a time
Yeah.
and just given a little kind of something to fiddle with just to occupy their attention, rather than just this sense of energy, the potential energy in the room that could be,
Yeah.
if there was enough resource, enough time, enough money, enough people, could be used in all sorts of wonderful ways. It just feels like
Yeah. Yeah.
we haven't
Absolutely.
quite squared that circle. Yeah, well, I think we're a
No.
long way from squaring that circle.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and that resonates with me as sort of two kinetic boys. Like, it's not an ADHD thing, but like sitting still and crafting, or listening to explanations of geopolitical concepts is not what they love to do most in the world.
They're not going to be listening to this then, are they?
I wouldn't have thought so. No.
Good. Let's leave it there for
Yeah.
today. So, as we say, we might kind of expand this to neurodiversity more generally in a small series of other conversations. But
Yeah, I think so. We're quite specific, weren't we, today? And I think there's
yeah,
definitely, in my practice, there are as many people who would show up on the autism spectrum.
yes, for sure, and exploring that through the lens of attachment as well might be fruitful.
Good
Good.
to
Good to see you. Take care. Bye for now.